Welcome everybody to AE911Truth Webinars. My name is Richard Gage, architect, member of the American Institute of Architects, and 28 years as an architect. I'm very excited today to be broadcasting from the middle of our 12-city tour of the Southeast United States. We're now in St. Petersburg, Florida, where we will present tonight at the University of Florida Student Center in the Ballroom 1. Very exciting opportunity to have our fourth presentation in Florida. We started off in Jacksonville, then St. Augustine, then Gainesville. Two presentations in Gainesville, one to the Kiwanis Club where we had 50 people, most of whom were brand new to this material, and many of which were quite moved. In fact, two civil engineers there came to the event that night in Gainesville to see our film, which we're highlighting on this tour. Firefighters, architects, engineers expose 9/11 myths. And that's what we'll be showing tonight, as well as answering questions and entertaining an intense dialogue about the implications of the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Let me introduce you to our operations coordinator, Mr. Andy Steele.
Hi, everybody. As I always do at the beginning of these webinars, I just want to remind you that you can boost the resolution in the picture because YouTube defaults to a lower resolution. Simply by clicking the gearbox beneath the video screen, selecting 720 HD resolution. That'll make you see the slides in more clearer picture. Also, we are going to be taking questions during this webinar. You can submit your questions in the box beneath the screen. The questions that we're going to be taking, though, are going to be the ones that are related to the information that Richard's going to be presenting in today's presentation. So other aspects of 9/11 or other parts of the normal presentation put on by Richard, if they're asked, we're going to cover those in later webinar series. So again, thank you for coming, and Richard, back to you.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm telling you, it's incredible to have Andy here with us. He will be looking through the questions and making sure we get to all of them, and the best ones first too. We love being challenged, don't we, Andy?
Absolutely. So we hope that we have lots of professionals out there in the audience, people that who are aware of some of these concepts and deeper engineering concepts. We do want to be challenged, and we take all questions.
Awesome. And so why not just begin? Well, let's begin with this. We just completed last weekend our I don't know, 5th or 6th annual AIA convention, where we had a booth with 8 to 10 volunteers, most of which were busy at any given time speaking with the hundreds of architects that came by the booth. We've given, well, probably almost 1,000 out of the 10,000 in this annual convention in Philadelphia. And we had on the floor of the annual convention 400 of the top architects in the country, and they had to deal with World Trade Center 7 because we had 97 co-sponsors of the resolution calling upon the AIA for a new investigation of Building 7. It calls upon the AIA to call for a new investigation. And last year we received 3% of the vote. We needed 51 to win. This year we got almost 3 times that many votes. It was very exciting for us. You know, it's an uphill battle. We didn't expect to come in here winning, but we did expect progress, and we were pleased with the progress we got. Next year, we expect to achieve 1,000 co-sponsored AIAs, because we're going to work hard to get to every one of the AIA conventions at the state level before we come back to the national convention in 1 year. That is our most exciting effort ever, because we can sign up 100 architects, most of whom are AIA members, at any given convention, and therefore achieve co-sponsors in the number of 1,000. That is very exciting, because when we go back next year on the floor and we say, last year we had 97 co-sponsors, which is twice as many as we need to put this resolution on the ballot. This year we have 10 times that many. Now that's pretty exciting. So we expect to have next year maybe 30% of the vote. So it may take a few more years, couple more years to educate the profession to the point where we actually win the vote and get these people at this high level of architectural professionals who work for the richest people in the country having to then deal with, because their rank and file is forcing them to call for a new investigation. You'll see why as we proceed today with the presentation with the World Trade Center Twin Towers, this being week 4 of our 4-week webinar series. Now, I have, just so you know a little bit about me, those of you who are new, I have worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums more recently. I've done a lot of high school work, and this is a construction project. I managed the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. Also, more recently though, in Nevada, we have 6 blocks of retail, including a mid-rise building here with altogether over 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. And this was about 4 years ago. Like myself, there are 2,500 now as a result of the Philadelphia Annual Convention, almost 2,700 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these 3 towers. That's a lot of credibility, and we're used by the 9/11 Truth movement as a great point of credibility, the tip of the spear, if you will, heading for the Achilles heel of those who brought us 9/11. So we're not only looking for an investigation into the evidence you're going to be seeing or hearing today on the webinar, but also justice on the part of the families of the victims of 9/11. Last week, we looked at the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This week, we're looking in week 4 at the evidence of pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel or iron invading the steel, the evidence of ignited ignited and unignited nanothermite, a fascinating topic for today. So let's proceed as we have a review first. What happened that morning? How did this official story develop? Here we go.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's pretty much the official story in a nutshell, laid out for us by the gentleman on the street that morning. And here we have, sure enough, the experts confirming that. Well, we're going to test that. And we test it with the scientific method. It's been around for 100 years or so in the West, and we have a pretty good idea of how to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. You have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research. How have other towers come down? We make some observations and we construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. I think they came down by fire. Maybe they came down by controlled demolition. We lay out all of the hypotheses without our biasing ourselves with preconceived ideas. This is objective. That's the purpose of the scientific method. So we test those hypotheses with objective experiments. We analyze the results of those experiments and we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. If not, we go back and we try again. We construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the objective research, the experiments, the results. So with that in mind, what we're going to do today is look at the evidence. We're going to apply the scientific method. We're going to look and see what are the typical features of a controlled demolition. Now, we went over these in some detail in week 1 and 2, but we're going to be reviewing and seeing if there's any evidence today with the correlation with the typical features of the hypothesis of controlled demolition, typical features of other demolitions. And we're going to start and see if there's any direct evidence of explosive destruction, because with these features, like a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, straight down symmetrical collapse, free fall acceleration through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the total dismemberment of the steel structure for broken up and ready for loading and shipment, minimal damage to adjacent structures, sounds of explosions and flashes of light, which we heard last week in week 3's seminar. And by the way, if you didn't see that, you really need to. You can see the video. Just click on it right down there below. The archive of each of our weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all there to look at. We'll be looking for squibs. Well, we saw last week squibs, explosive charges visible at the upper floors. This week we're going to be focusing on chemical evidence of cutter charges in extreme hot temperatures. Now, fire can't really be responsible for any of these, let alone all of them. So that's very interesting. We're separating the evidence for fire bringing down skyscrapers, which has never happened, as you'll see, with the evidence for explosions. Well, if we have government documentation and experts agreeing, hey, it's a controlled demolition, at least those experts who don't have preconceived biases, controlled demolition experts that, for instance, aren't in the United States and don't have $100,000 contracts with the federal government, those would be more objective opinions we would be interested in. Foreknowledge, if it takes months to bring down a skyscraper, so if we have foreknowledge, that can be very helpful. This is all proof, of course, of controlled demolition. With this in mind, we're going to be looking again. Well, last week we looked at the first 8 key characteristic features. We're going to be looking today and focusing on pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. Let's begin with an examination real quick of the National Fire Protection Association's 921 Guide for Investigation of Fire and Explosions. What do they say? Look for blast pressure wave effects shrapnel effects, and today particularly thermal effects. That's what we're focusing on. Well, they say large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions cause rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. That is evidence of explosions. And of course, these were observed before, during, and directly after the final destruction. As you see here, released from the Twin Towers after hundreds of witnesses heard and saw and experienced sounds of flashes, sounds of explosions, and seeing flashes of light. We have these thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds releasing the cauliflower-shaped gases due to all the incredible heat from the chemical reactions, flowing at 35 miles an hour in every direction away from the Twin Towers. Much more heat released here than the fires, which particularly in the case of the South Tower were almost out before that tower came down about 50 minutes after it was hit by the plane. So you can see these massive heat clouds released, and the witnesses experiencing an incredibly hot temperatures on them as they're trying to run away from all of these massive clouds with this thick edge of pulverized building solids, the concrete, forming this thick edge between the cloud and surrounding atmosphere. The extremely rapidly expanding cauliflower-like plumes are not caused by fires or gravitational collapse. It can only be caused by intense heat from these expanding explosives, which we're going to be looking for evidence of now, particularly iron microspheres in the World Trade Center dust and pools of molten iron. In fact, again, before, during, and after the final destruction of the towers, Bechtel, particularly afterward, documents very carefully 2,800 degrees temperatures underground. Where are they getting those kind of temperatures from? This is the melting point of iron or steel. Fires can't even get half that hot in these temperatures, as particularly these fires in these buildings, which are shown by the thick black smoke as to be almost starving of oxygen. Richard Garlock of Leslie Robertson Associates documents it was really, really hot. We had rescue teams. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. This is the architect, the structural engineer working for Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center itself. Let's look and see what these first responders and demolition contractors are saying about the molten metal. Saw pools of literally molten steel, they're calling it. Peter Tully, the president of the Tully Construction, leading the cleanup effort. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams excavated from deep beneath the layers of subfloors. And here, molten iron or steel, it turns out to be molten iron, tests show, pouring out of the South Tower minutes before its collapse. It says, well, this can't be molten steel or molten iron. It must be melted airplane. Well, melted airplane looks like molten aluminum, which doesn't glow bright yellow, bright orange, bright white in daylight conditions. It's silvery in substance. So that can't be true, what they're saying. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was tasked by Congress with explaining the collapse of all three of these World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event, says this firefighter. Molten steel at the heart of the human remains, says this National Guard first responder. Molten steel beams, says the sanitation spokeswoman. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. Dripping molten steel, says this VP of sales. Well, here you can see what we're talking about. Liquid metal falling from the material held in the crab claw jaws of this excavator. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says Jonathan Barnett, the author of the FEMA report that looked carefully at the metallurgy of the beams in the Appendix C of the FEMA report. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says Abolhazen Astani Azal, who had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill, documenting this piece of steel from World Trade Center 7 with melted. Now, this, first responders, structural engineers have not seen the firefighters. They don't see this because fires don't melt. Office fires don't melt steel. It takes extraordinarily high temperatures, which are documented in this FEMA report in its Appendix C by Jonathan Barnett and Professor Sisson and others. What do they document? Never before observed in building fires, eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see here from this piece in World Trade Center 7, which of course was not hit by an airplane, didn't have jet fuel associated with it. But even if it did, jet fuel is just a hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs, 500, 1,000 degrees, maybe. In the worst conditions, another maybe 1,500 degrees at the most. We're talking temperatures here that exceed that by 2 or 3 times. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. A liquid iron. Now that's molten iron. This is very carefully documented. This is not documented by the 9/11 Truth Movement. This is documented by FEMA themselves. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur. Where did it come from? Well, they guess that it might have come from the gypsum board. Well, guess what? Gypsum board has been used for almost 100 years to protect steel and iron. It has never turned around and attacked the steel or iron that it is designed to protect. No, calcium sulfate is bonded. It doesn't release the sulfur and attack the steel. It burned. The smell of that sulfur. So where did the sulfur come from? We're going to be taking a look at that. It's very clearly documented here in this metallurgical examination, the sulfur eutectic reaction. In fact, the temperatures are so hot, they melted concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. Concrete melts at above 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. What's responsible for these incredible temperatures? Well, this concrete is formed like a lava, forming itself around this weapon in the police department in Building 6. And we have Bart Forsanger.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
This fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
So they call them meteorites because they don't know what else to call them. They've never seen this material before. Well, it's not molten steel, actually, because and it's not aluminum because it doesn't rust. Aluminum and it doesn't rust. So we know it's not like NIST claimed aluminum from the airplane, these fused molten iron meteorites. Well, these temperatures are documented on the surface by overflights from the NASA airplanes, infrared sensitive cameras 1,340 degree temperatures on the surface. But guess what? There's no temperatures, there's no fires on the surface that could be responsible for these temperatures. So these temperatures are radiating from the source of the heat down in the basements below World Trade Center 1 and 2, where we have 1,100 and 1,300 degree temperatures on the surface. So the temperatures below in the basement must be much, much, much hotter. And of course, that's what's documented with the molten iron temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees by Bechtel and others. But what does the official story spokesman say about this phenomenon? Uh-oh. All of a sudden, I don't have sound from John Gross. This is John Gross. And for the first time, he is not talking to us. So hopefully we'll go on and find out why. Oh, now we know why. Here's John Gross.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
Down below, and you see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall.
The cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks. This fused element of steel, molten steel.
They pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Well, that was Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, talking about a river of steel flowing, not realizing that what he was saying completely contradicts the official story, which he has been representing ever since 9/11. So we would love to debate him about that personally. Well, what's the problem here? The temperatures are maybe 1,200 degrees, as supported by Thomas Iger, who supports the official theory, 1,200 Fahrenheit. But structural steel doesn't melt until 27, 2,800 degrees. What can create these temperatures? We'll be looking at thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Well, this is pretty fascinating. I mean, we definitely have steel and iron melted during the event. What caused it to melt? Well, here's John Gross on the pile, identifying the very piece of steel that was given to FEMA for their metallurgical analysis. And you saw that metallurgical analysis, yet John Gross and others have ejected from the final NIST report, because they came over and took over the report from FEMA after 2002, and we no longer have that metallurgical analysis. But here he is. His shadow is all over the evidence. Do we have chemical evidence, though, of thermite cutter charges in the steel? Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Fascinating. So now we have a possible source for the massive heat, which was unexplained by the official story. We have a possible source for the sulfur, which was documented by FEMA but unexplained by the official story. And we have a possible source for these extreme temperatures. Wow, we're getting somewhere now, maybe. Well, the NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation says that you should look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, which is an accelerant or incendiary. NIST acknowledges now that it did not look for such evidence. After claiming that they found no evidence, they acknowledge, well, we never really looked. Others, though, have independent scientists like Stephen Jones, and he's a nuclear physicist, and he finds the signature of thermite. If there was a signature, it would contain common elements like iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, and unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements on the periodic table, well, somebody sent him a piece of this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal from one of these meteorites. And so a small chip was sent to him, and he does an analysis. He finds it's predominantly iron. This is elemental iron. So he can rule out aluminum, clearly, from the jet planes that NIST claimed. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel. In other words, it's not melted steel beams. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, potassium, manganese and fluorine in abundance. Of course, manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. So with these materials present in the residue, they're part of a thermite fingerprint. And it's found in this second source, this 9/11 monument also. He does X-ray fluorescence and finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Well, thermite can cut through steel, and this is not an oxyacetylene torch cut that they were using out at the site during the cleanup. This is a very irregular cut that is peppered with aluminum residue, which thermite releases also. Here's a common oxyacetylene torch cut. See the difference? Very clean, and in this case, not so clean. So other examples of tests are done, like this International Peace Park in Manitoba, Canada. They find more aluminum residue on it. These sculptures are all over the world, actually. And they still serve as very important evidence, even though 98% of the steel was carted away, shipped to China for recycling before investigators could get to the steel. A tremendous illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Yet much of it remains and has been documented, as you see. Well, Stephen Jones, does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, and he finds the signature again of thermite, including iron, silica, aluminum, potassium, manganese. Now, others, like John Cole, a civil engineer in his own backyard in Florida, has created experiments in which he created his own cutter charges himself with thermate. Take a look. Cutting right through the steel, leaving razor sharp edges. You can see his whole video on this and other subjects. They're incredible. Just Google John Cole thermite experiment, civil engineer. They're amazing. Well, there are more elaborately designed, technically superior cutter charges that have patents using thermite, which issue molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through steel than even the high energy explosives like C4 and RDX. You see, those provide loud bangs and very bright flashes, a signature of controlled demolition that wouldn't be wanted in a deceptive controlled demolition like the 3 skyscrapers on 9/11. So maybe the choice was made to use this material instead, and it has its own signature, but perhaps they thought it would be less suspicious. Well, they seem to have gotten away with it because NIST and FEMA ignored the evidence of molten iron all over the rubble pile of several of these buildings at the World Trade Center. In fact, there's an invention that uses thermite as the casing around this cutter charge. In this case, it's not exactly a cutter charge, but an igniter. But the point is that there would be nothing left in the residue except pools of molten iron, because the casing itself would be destroyed and turned to molten iron. So that's a possibility that needs to be looked at too. Now, sol gels are a very special form of thermite that would leave a residue 1,3-diphenyl propane. Interestingly enough, Eric Schwartz finds from the EPA, one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. But here it is at levels that dwarfed all others in the World Trade Center, and it's not mainstream media news. Well, how about this? What else was found in the powder dropped across Lower Manhattan in a 3-square-mile area in a 4-inch thick blanket composed of 30% or so concrete? The night we saw last week, 90,000 tons of concrete turned to a powder about 100 microns in size. These concrete pieces are powder particles. Well, interesting. Molten iron microspheres are found throughout this dust by R.J. Lee, an environmental firm doing toxicological studies on the dust. They find spherical elemental iron particles. They can't explain it. They don't know where all of these previously molten iron microspheres are coming from, but they document it very, very carefully. And they call it a signature element. In fact, up to 6% of some of these dust samples are composed of iron microspheres that are unexplained. They're a signature component. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unexplained iron microspheres. The only way that you can get a sphere of iron, molten iron, is if it is dispersed as an aerosol under explosive conditions, because a liquid, the molten iron liquid, the byproduct of thermite, is dispersed and the surface temperature forms itself into a sphere, much like a raindrop. And these are found by many, many others. In fact, here's an experiment that shows you how these are formed. And at half size, you see thousands of what? Molten iron droplets cooling and falling with all of the dust. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center? What else could be responsible? This explains that evidence a whole lot more than anything else. But what else did they find in the dust? Well, a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen analyzed a total of 7 samples, focusing in on 4 of them, one of them from this apartment across the street, almost from the South Tower by Jeanette McKinley. But all 4 samples have the same curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They look like paint. They're about a 1/16 of an inch long, the largest ones. But they zoom in and find in the red layer with an XEDS analysis, what do they find? Iron, aluminum, silica, oxygen, carbon, the signature of thermite. What is the signature of thermite doing in very special red-gray chips, composing by extrapolation up to 5 or 10 tons of this material spread across lower Manhattan? Well, they zoom in on the red layer very carefully with 50,000 times, and they find these small red-gray, these small iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal in shape, and these extremely small aluminum platelets. These are at the nanoscale. They're 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. They're in a percentage to become thermite. Thermite's composed of iron oxide and aluminum powder. And they're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. That does gaseous expansion, or the pressure work, or the blast work associated normally with high energy explosives like TNT, RDX, C4. So you have an incendiary which is engineered to become more explosive. Fascinating. And because of the small particle size, the chemical reaction is almost instantaneous. They put these in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, and at about 420 degrees centigrade, maybe 600 or 800 degrees Fahrenheit, they ignite, just like the material that is published on this material, on this this very, very classified these components by the Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos laboratory. What do they produce when they ignite at these temperatures? They produce molten iron spheres, as you see in the top section here, with the same chemical signature almost as what is produced or what is found in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where these spheres of molten iron came from. It's not like it's a mystery. It's been figured out by this team of scientists led by Niels Harrit, as if we didn't know, because many of these small red-gray chips are found partially ignited and attached to these previously molten iron microspheres, as you see here. So you see, this is a completely self-corroborating set of evidence, internally consistent, that could put a lot of people away for treason and mass murder if this evidence can be properly packaged and given to members of an uncorrupt judicial system who would compose a real investigation into who might be responsible for placing this material in the World Trade Center. That's beyond our work. We have the evidence. We'll provide it, and we will be packaging it with a group of attorneys actually for that purpose. But it's going to take a system that is dedicated to pursuing justice for the families of the 9/11 victims. This is called super thermite. It's been researched actually before 9/11 and after by Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And it's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is a very, very sophisticated material which is built from the atomic scale up. It's not ground down iron oxide. It's not created from falling aluminum panels from the World Trade Center mixing somehow with some rust off the beams of the... No. We saw last week very, very fine series of thousands of explosions from the top of the point of jet plane impacts of each of the two World Trade Centers towers all the way down. And this particular research has been documented very carefully in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, Bentham, and it has not been challenged. It has not been challenged by any kind of peer-reviewed process, which is what we do in science. If you want to challenge somebody's conspiracy theory, you put up your own paper and you say this is ridiculous because of A, B, C, D. You don't just wave your hand and say, hey, that's paint. Well, paint doesn't have these extraordinarily exotic properties. So this is direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, we believe, let alone all 10 of these characteristic features and uncharacteristic features of explosive controlled demolition, because the Twin Towers exhibit some very explosive behavior, which Building 7, a classic implosion, doesn't. Well, with data from the FEMA and NIST reports, which we'll take a look at here, we believe we have sufficient evidence and opinion. In fact, FEMA, according to Bill Manning, the editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, says it's a half-baked farce, this FEMA investigation, that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers, says one of the top fire protection engineers in the country. How about that NIST report, which was a $20 million effort to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed and how and why 7 collapsed? Well, what was their objective? This is a quote. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse in each tower. For brevity in this report, this is referred to as a probable collapse sequence. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for a collapse initiation were reached, and they claim collapse became inevitable. Wait a minute. You spent $20 million in 3 years tasked by Congress to explain to the American people how this building collapsed, and you stopped your entire 10,000-page report at the initiation of collapse? Wait a minute. Structural engineers do this every day for a living. Calculate the ability of the cold, hard, intact steel below a point of collapse to resist that collapse, especially with 90,000 tons of structural steel below that point of initiation. It couldn't have happened, as we saw last week. And NIST merely says, well, we saw how it came down. It's a mountain of distraction. 10,000 pages of distraction. Only 1/2 page on the events following collapse initiation. Let's look. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through the energy of deformation. This is speculation. This is not analysis. There's no analysis here. They say it came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait, what was that report called? The final report on the collapse. It should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse. This is a massive effort to obscure and hide the the truth from the American people and from the hundreds of thousands of architects and engineers in this country who don't even know about most of them, the third tower that came down, who don't even know that NIST stopped their entire effort at the initiation of collapse. They say, in fact, hey, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. That's for sure. What do the experts say? Well, we have 80 to 100 structural engineers among the 20. Now we have 2,700 2,700 architects and engineers as a result of our efforts recently in Boston and in Philadelphia who have yet to appear because they're all verified individually. Like Ron Brookman, who says, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism, referring to the Twin Towers. As a structural engineer, I believe the laws of physics and rely on them every day. Why the complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable? He wants to know that. Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? It's swept under the rug. And William Rice, structural engineer, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near freefall acceleration, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer in the UK, near freefall collapse violates laws of physics. And this fire protection engineer with AE911Truth, all three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Pretty clear. You can begin to see after you listen to these experts. In fact, like Edward Munyak, fire protection engineer, these collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. That's because high-rise fires, as we saw last week, do not bring high-rises down. They never have before or since 9/11. But on 9/11, we have three. Even the FEMA team member, Mathis Levy, who wrote the book, Why Buildings Fall Down. What does he say?
I've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Pretty interesting, but that's not what he followed up with as he became a part of the FEMA team. Nor with Ronald Hamburger, another FEMA team member whom I had the opportunity to speak with at the Structural Engineering Conference, where we had a booth trying to educate structural engineers, in which we got about 50 of them to sign our petition. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. How did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? Why didn't his investigations include and consider demolition? Well, we believe at AE911Truth that the evidence is very clear and convincing that the hypothesis is corroborated for the controlled demolition, and that we have shown with respect to weeks 1, 2, 3, well, weeks 3 and 4 with regard to the Twin Towers, that we have direct evidence of explosive destruction, that fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. With additional corroborative support, we find proof of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt. And we're inviting you, if you agree with us, to take some steps. It's very simple steps. Sign our petition. If you're an AIA member, support us with our next resolution at the annual convention of the American Institute of Architects, calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation of Building 7. You can sign the petition right on the website. You can become a member of AE911Truth for $2, $5, $10 a month or more. that puts you in concert with us to make sure that our mission succeeds. Donate liberally. We have a lot of very important projects, like going to the American Institute of Architects, which was a $20,000 effort, which we did have very generous members amounting to hundreds supporting us to go there. That's the only way we can do this, is if you support us. As well, we have opportunities for you to volunteer with AE911Truth. And here to tell us more about that is Mr. Andy Steele, our volunteer coordinator.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, we have a lot of great opportunities and projects that we are thinking of right now as we push forward, coming back from the AIA conference. A lot of good ideas for reaching out to various professionals, people in government. So we need your help. If you're moved by this evidence, then simply go to the What You Can Do tab at the top of AE911Truth.org. Click volunteer and fill out the volunteer form, and we will be in touch with you and get you started. We need all the help we can get. Back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And guess what? There's other things you can do too. Email and write your elected representatives, local television, radio, newspaper. These people have to be hounded in order to act, because they seem to be more responsive to their upper level management, which sets an agenda for them, which unfortunately does not include the truth about what really happened at the World Trade Center on 9/11. So it's a grassroots movement that we're talking about here to wake up the American people, the professionals, the media representatives, and elected representatives. Tell everyone you know. Share the DVDs. Speak to new audiences. Take these resources that we have, such as Beyond Misinformation, our 50-page booklet, which we have now given to 20,000 architects and engineers who are academics. And we also, it's 40,000, 50,000 of these have been given out at this point. And you can get this for free. Just click on the link below. Get the Beyond Misinformation booklet. It's a PDF which we'll send to you right away. As I mentioned, we're now in the midst of our Southeast tour. This was our last tour, completed just a couple of weeks ago in the Northwest. But we're very excited about showing the movie Firefighters, Architects, and Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths, which features Eric Lawyer of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. Eric has been captured on film in a presentation he did with me. There is a 1-hour version of this film that you can see on YouTube right now. Just Google Firefighters, Architects, and Engineers. Eric Lawyer, Richard Gage, any part of that will bring it up. And we have a landmark DVD called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. And I want to play for you the 2-minute trailer, or maybe it's 3 minutes. And we're very, very proud of this effort and hope you will also download it from YouTube, the 1-hour version, but get the 90-minute version also available at our store, AE911Truth.org. Click on What Can You Do? Up at the top, that brings you to our store. Here's the trailer.
Conspiracy theories, and there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
That is the film which will change America, we hope, but only if you share it with lots and lots of people. We can't reach everybody ourselves, but you, our viewers, our supporters, can. And so this week, we looked at the Twin Towers and the evidence of extreme heat. Next week, we'll be looking again at Building 7, focusing in on the third worst structural failure in modern history that most architects and engineers are completely unaware of, and why it is so important. The smoking gun of 9/11 becomes so clear to everybody that we've not been told the truth. And at this point, I'd like to invite Andy to help us with a few questions, because I think we've got some, don't we, Andy?
Yes, we do. So I'll just go over them one after another. You can answer them. How does NIST write off the FEMA documentation of Swiss cheese beams when asked about it?
Well, I don't think NIST is asked about it, frankly. They certainly can't answer with any intelligence or integrity why they have excluded the evidence that FEMA provided for the melting of steel, which is evidence of the extreme hot temperatures that jet fuel in normal office fires or even abnormal office fires can account for. They have no answer for this.
Okay, our next question asks, did the extreme heat contribute to the massive expansion of dust that morning?
Yes, we've learned from the NFPA 921, the Guide for Explosion Investigation, that investigators should be looking for evidence of extreme heat in these unfolding cauliflower-shaped plumes that are expanding rapidly. that we see in all three World Trade Center skyscrapers racing away from the building, and these thickly defined edges, that can only be accounted for by the massive expansion of heat due to chemical reactions in incendiaries. In this case, we're talking 3,000-4,000 degree temperatures. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate the ends of the steel beams, as Jonathan Barnett carefully highlighted in his surprising reaction to this massive massive extreme heat. So this is why we've got to have a real investigation, because NIST completely ignored and ejected this report, this metallurgical examination from their final report. In fact, they said they found no evidence for heat exceeding 250 centigrade, maybe about 500 Fahrenheit, in the steel from the metallographic paint analysis from steel samples that were chosen direct because of their proximity to the point of jet plane impact. So the heat is in their view non-existent, because they're trying to balance it. They can have it both ways. On the one hand, they're trying to say that there was the fires were really hot, 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. It takes to reduce the steel members and create weakness at their half strength, so that they can show a failure due to fire. But they don't even have evidence to support temperatures of those. On the other hand, they're trying to deny the temperatures of extreme heat that's capable of melting steel. So they're really caught between a rock and a hard place.
Okay, our next question asks, has John Gross been spoken to again about his molten steel comment?
Not that I'm aware of. We have peppered NIST with all kinds of questions over the years, and have gotten so tired of their non-responses that I think we've given up. We don't have access to the co-project leader, John Gross, or his project lead, Sham Sunder. So I invite people who feel the need to go after him and his cohorts with some degree of tenacity in order to pursue something, but we haven't found that a fruitful exercise ourselves.
Okay, next question asks, what do you have to say about the firefighters who were heard on radio saying that the fires were manageable and could be knocked out with 2 lines?
Well, it's fascinating that Chief Oriole Palmer, who went up into the South Tower and found only a few small fires, that he called for 2 fire hoses and said, we can put these out, in fact, the evidence shows from the external videos looking at the buildings that these fires were almost out 10 minutes prior to that building's collapse. So we're not talking about extremely hot fires. In fact, they're full of black smoke, indicating they are oxygen starved, according to the fire protection engineer as well. So do you have any other insight on that question, Andy?
Well, I think that the opinions of the firefighters should be heard in the moment and on the scene. That certainly should be looked at by the people that were tasked with investigating this fully. As other aspects of that morning have been overlooked, we've talked about them in other webinars, with the 118 first responders reporting explosions, the accounts, 118 of them there were from Graham McQueen's study. That's been overlooked too. So when you put all of this together and you look into the science of that day that Richard is presenting here, you see a lot of things that were overlooked. And indeed, if firefighters were saying that the fires were manageable, that should be factored into NIST's analysis.
Definitely. Thanks.
Okay, our last question this morning, or this afternoon, I should say, is if fires were that hot, how is it that you can see a woman standing in a hole left by the airplane impacts?
Well, in the North Tower, we have Edna Citron, who is the woman standing in the hole left by the plane. The fire had moved around to the other side of the building and up onto upper floors in the North Tower, and she is standing there looking for rescue, which never came. And the fires, the fires where they were, I'm sure they're 500-600 degrees, but they've moved on, allowing her to create this incredible emotional presence of an unrescued victim, and I think it should haunt all of us, actually.
Okay, that was the last question, so I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We're going to be doing these every week, so thank you for the questions. And if your question wasn't answered today because it was off topic from this aspect of the regular presentations, keep tuning in and we will get around to that aspect and be able to answer it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andy, and thanks everybody for listening. We're very grateful. You can pass the archive of this webinar around to people you want to hear and see the same evidence that you just heard and saw. We've got to do something. This is a time when our country is calling upon all of us to do everything we can to get this information out. And the simplest way you can do that is to take the AE911Truth.org link and pass it to everybody on your mailing list and say, hey, there's 2,500 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation. Would you take a look at this and tell me what you think? That way you're not sticking your neck out for people to call you a conspiracy theorist. You're just asking a question. And let the 2,500 architects and engineers that I represent do the sticking of the neck out for you. It's really quite effective, we found. And for those of you who are in Florida, we're going to be in St. Petersburg tonight. We're going to be in Sarasota tomorrow in the afternoon. We're going to be in Miami on Sunday night. Birmingham, Alabama, we move on to on Monday night. Huntsville, Tuesday night. Then on up into Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Asheville, North Carolina, and then over to Atlanta, Georgia. That schedule is on our website. You can click on it. It'll take you to our Facebook page. You can see the entire schedule there. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your attendance today. And we'll catch up with you next Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern with week number 1, where we go back to Building 7, the smoking gun of 9/11. Bye-bye.